So I'm coming here. I'm jumping to this session. I was supposed to be speaking after. Oh, thank you. After Edri, which in a session, in a panel that we had early in the afternoon about, well, I think it was about copyright reform, but maybe it was broader, the topic. So at Comunia, we work on copyright reform, and we have been adopting different approaches. And in this specific project, our approach was more on a positive tone. We tried to present best practices, like best models, the best national exceptions to copyright in different fields that the European Commission could adopt as a model for harmonizing exceptions in these four specific topics that we researched and studied as a model for every country. So okay, so these are the four scenarios that we analyzed: freedom of panorama, education, quotations, and parody. We discovered that in these countries, quotations in Finland, educations in Estonia, parody in France, and panorama in Portugal, these four countries had the best exceptions in these four different areas. And we thought well, how did we come to this conclusion? Well, it all started with a first research that I did on exceptions and limitations to copyright for educational purposes. So this was 2 years ago. I did this research where I compared all the exceptions for educational purposes in all the countries of Europe, which was kind of a crazy idea and a crazy project, because I had to analyze exceptions that are drafted in languages that I don't understand. So I analyzed English versions that were not, in some cases, updated. But that's what you have in Europe. So you have a lack of harmonization and a lack of information, because you don't even know what the other countries foresee in their laws. Just to give you some background, we have an exhaustive list of exceptions and limitations. We have 21 exceptions and limitations in the InfoSoc Directive, which countries can or not adopt. There's only one exception that's mandatory. It's an exception for ephemeral copies. All the other exceptions that protect important public interests, such as freedom to education or freedom of expression, access to education, freedom of creation, these exceptions are not harmonized, and countries can or not implement them. And if they decide to implement it, they can implement it in a more narrower way than what is foreseen in the InfoSoc Directive. So what we tried to do was give data, give evidence, try to convince the European Commission that there was evidence of the social and economic benefits of adopting these exceptions as they are in these laws. So what do these four cases have in common? They all take full advantage of the policy space that is available in the InfoSoc Directive. And how do they do that? In the case of freedom of panorama and education, freedom of panorama in Portugal and education in Estonia, what these countries did, or the lawmakers in these countries did, was to make an almost literal transposition of the prototype, so basically of the provision, of the legal provision that is in the InfoSoc Directive. In the other two cases, parody in France and quotations in Finland, they didn't do a literal transposition, but they draft the law in a way that respects the limits of the InfoSoc Directive. And so what they have in common, and what makes them, from our perspective, which is the perspective of the users' rights, the perspective of the public interests that are at stake in these four cases. So what makes them interesting is that they are so flexible. So they cover an open network of users. So the exception is not drafted in a way as we see now in the new proposal of the Commission that only benefits certain institutions. For instance, the educational proposal in the new Digital Single Market Directive, or in the proposal for a new Digital Single Market Directive, the new exception only covers educational establishments, while we know that there's much more institutions and individuals and groups of people doing educational activities or doing uses of protected works for educational purposes. So we don't think that a good exception is an exception that limits the uses under the exception through the beneficiaries. So we think that a good exception will be limited by the purpose, not by the beneficiaries. So in all these 4 cases, panorama, parody, quotations, and educations, what we saw in these 4 countries, and the exceptions covered an unlimited, an open-ended network of users. So the law didn't specify who was covered, and therefore it's open-ended, and everyone can use it. The acts covered are all the acts that are harmonized under the InfoSoc directive, and also other acts that are not harmonized, such as the right of transformation, of adaptation. The works covered are any copyright material, so the law doesn't specify if I can only use text or 3D works or whatever. So it's like you can use protected works for this purpose. So completely flexible and open in terms of users, acts, and works. In all these 4 cases, they were free of charge, so no remuneration was due to authors or rights holders, and the limits were only on the purpose. So you can do it for purpose of education, you can do it for purposes of, in the case of parody, for humorous, with a humorous intent, and so forth. And of course, by the three-step text. Well, in the educational case, in the education exception, there was also a limit on the purposes, because the InfoSoc directive says that you cannot make uses under the exception for other purposes that are can only make uses under the exception covered that are considered exempted under the exception if they are for non-commercial purposes. Therefore, in Estonia, if they respect the InfoSoc directive, they also have to have this limit. From my perspective, it would be better to have something like fair uses are permitted if they are in accordance with fair practice, because we know that the concept of non-commercial, of commercial uses can be a very tricky concept. But in any case, and after seeing the European Commission proposal, I would say, give me at any time of the day the non-commercial limitation, because that's better than what they are proposing right now, which we'll see what it is. So just to give you another, so we did this, this study and we wanted to show that the exception is broad and flexible. Wow. But it also has economic benefits. So we studied examples of the use in these countries, and we found amazing things that are happening thanks to this exception. So for instance, in Portugal, and that's the only example that I'm going to talk about because I only have 2 minutes. In Portugal, the Lisbon municipality runs a new urban art gallery on Facebook and different social media platforms where they promote street art and other types of urban art. So they basically take pictures or make videos, and then they post it online. And this is only possible because there is a freedom of panorama exception in Portugal that's flexible in terms of users, in terms of acts, in terms of works that can be used under the exception. This doesn't harm the artists. Quite the contrary, because they are gaining visibility, and this is only possible because of this exception. So parody, the same thing, and quotations and education. So what would have been an ideal proposal from the Commission? I think an ideal proposal, especially considering that we are, right now, we have a high level of harmonization and high level of protection of copyright. So we have 9 European directives on copyright, 1 horizontal directive on enforcement of intellectual property rights. We have been having European, so we have harmonized the concepts of work, the concept of what is a work, what should be protected. We have harmonized so much from the perspective of the authors and right holders, and nothing from the perspective of the educational institutions and other, and from the perspective of users' rights. So, so from my perspective, an ideal proposal would have been harmonizing those exceptions that we have nowadays already in the InfoSoc directive. So they are fairly open, they are flexible, and they protect the interests of the the public interest that they are supposed to protect. So it would be a fair balance to harmonize these exceptions all over Europe. Instead, the Commission is not harmonizing any of this. Actually, the only exception that they are proposing to do something about is the educational exception. And they are not harmonizing the exception that we already have. They're creating a new exception, which is going to be such a mess in schools. So it's a new exception that will coexist with the existing exception, which is very broad and open. And this new one is so narrow. I will just tell you what are the details of the exception, and then I'm finishing. I have 1 minute, right? So under this exception, only educational institutions and its pupils, students and teachers will benefit, will be able to make uses that are exempted under the exception. Think about educational activities run by libraries, museums. Think about vocational training, a company that provides vocational training, professional training to their workers. None of these educational acts will be covered under this exception because they only protect certain activities of certain entities. Then, well, everything okay with the works, you know, you protect all kinds of protected materials. More or less everything okay with the acts of use. It's not free of charge, like member states can decide if it will be subject to remuneration or not. And then, which is the second worst part of the proposal, there are technological limits. So what is said in the proposal is that you can make certain uses for certain acts for digital uses, provided that they take place on the premises of an educational establishment or through a secure electronic network. What does this mean? It means that, you know, websites that are run by universities nowadays that make available educational resources, that might code protected works, that might make use, that might be built upon protected works, they won't benefit from the exception. Like teachers' blogs, they won't be exempted under this proposal. Other types of community platforms that are on the open internet, they won't benefit from this exception. And I think it will be very difficult for a teacher in a classroom, or especially if we are streaming something. So now I'm here, I'm teaching you something, and it is being streaming online. So I'm at the premises, imagine that I'm at the premises of an educational establishment. In this case, we are not. We are in a cinema, which means that whatever uses I would be making here, they will not be protected under the educational exception. They might be protected under the quotation exception, but not under the educational exception because we are in the cinema. But imagine that I'm in an educational establishment and I'm streaming something. So maybe the acts that I'm doing on the face-to-face teaching, they will be exempted under the exception. But the people that are seeing on the other side, or the acts that will occur also on the other side of the streaming, in whatever country they are, they might not be exempted. So distance learning courses, etc. There are still a lot of things that we are thinking about how this could work and how complex it will be for teachers and students to understand which exception applies to the act of use. Okay, thank you so much.